introduce Frank. But I'm going to start by telling you that this is really a research project in progress. So we're going to be telling you as much about doing the research as what we found. And we've got all kinds of questions, and we suspect that you will too. Now, Frank Godlewski is he's our talented architect on the Historic Preservation Commission, and he has done a lot of this research. So we put our heads together and came up with all of this. So you want to start?
Yes, welcome. Thank you very much for coming out tonight to see our presentation. And I'm very grateful to be able to have all of this material to present to you, because there's a very, very good sort of amount of history in Caldwell that a lot of people really don't know about. So it's important that we bring to light all of the features of the community, and African American history is a very good part of that. And but what I'd like to do is to back up a little bit and give you an idea of African American history since even 1625, when the first Africans were brought to Paulus, which is Jersey City. And then we're going to talk about the Meadowlands, but this image is a very beautiful little house that is found in Montclair. It's sort of towards the top of the mountain at Crane's Gap. That's Bloomfield Avenue is called Crane's Gap. That's, you know, historically what it's called. And Montclair was called Cranetown, and this was a house. It's the oldest house surviving from the Revolutionary period in Montclair, and it's also the first house owned by an African American, a free African American, in 1831. And it's very interesting. There are very interesting stories weaved into this history, because the Crane family, who founded Montclair and were very important and prominent in horse neck, and that's Caldwell. Caldwell, Livingston, Essex Fells, that's all horse neck. Beverly's an expert on that. But this little house is emblematic. It's sort of like a little jewel or a beacon or a monument to this very interesting and diverse history that we have locally. That I think that when I present this to people, I've done a presentation on Montclair history, African American history. People are very surprised, because they didn't realize how important our local history is to American history. So Caldwell's history is something that is very, very, it's sort of like a first in the United States with a lot of our features. So let me go on. Here we have, you see New Barbados, and that's the Meadowlands. And you can see Manhattan over there. This is one of the first, this is sort of like 16, I would say this is what, you know, around 1620, 1600, 1650. But it's to show you New Barbados. Now, why were the Meadowlands called New Barbados? New Barbados was a land grant that when the English took over from the Dutch, so we have, you know, we know that the first Africans are with the Dutch, coming with the Dutch in 1625, and 11 of them are slaves. But I also want to point out that African Americans, free African Americans, are present also. There's not a lot of records, but we know that. So that's sort of like our territory, Caldwell, Montclair. We all come from sort of Newark, let's say, and we'll go over that again. So the British in 1664 take New Amsterdam, and the two proprietors, the British proprietors of New Jersey, are Lord John Berkeley and George Carteret. And what they do is they begin to subdivide the land in New Jersey. There's East New Jersey and West New Jersey. East New Jersey is closer to New York, and it has more of a relation to the port. So the deal was, if you were to purchase land in New Jersey from Lord Berkeley and Lord Carteret, you would get 60 acres of free land per slave that you brought in to New Jersey. And why is this? This was to encourage the beginnings of the New Jersey economy based on free slave labor, not paying for labor. So this is a very ugly fact in our local history, and unfortunately New Jersey was basically developed on the idea of the free labor of the slaves, and New Jersey remained a slave state until the very end. It was the farthest north state to abolish slavery, so that's sort of even with the Emancipation Proclamation. So we wanted you to see Lord Berkeley and Lord Carteret. These men rescinded titles in Horseneck, provoking the Horseneck riots. So that's Beverly will. Do we want to go over that a little bit right now?
I've done that before. We did that in our last lecture.
Oh, okay. But
questions, we'll answer them.
Yeah, because of Lord Berkeley and Carteret, and sort of like afterwards, the titles to people's land here were rescinded. They had to buy their land again. So that provoked the Horseneck riots. And what was the year of the beginning of the Horseneck riots?
1741.
I beg your pardon?
1741.
1741.
Why did they rescind the titles?
Because they could.
They did a lot of terrible things.
They claimed that Indian deeds were illegal, and they actually had passed a law retroactively making deeds illegal. The Puritans who came into Newark were very proud of tracking down the tribes and getting deeds and paying for their land. But Berkeley and Carteret, they had spent a lot of their time in England. They weren't always here, and there were other people that were selling the land for them. So there was much confusion, lots sold more than once, and by 1702, they were really pushing the colonists very hard. And the colonists, of course, if you know the story, they arrested a Baldwin in his lot in Verona. He cutting down a tree, and they arrested him for trespassing and took him to the jail in Newark. And by the end of the day, his friends and family had come down and broken him out of jail. That was the first riot in Newark, and it wasn't African Americans who did it; it was white people.
And didn't they even walk down? They sort of
Well,
stormed.
that's the only way they got
Yeah, they
there.
stormed down to Newark to get him out of jail.
So these men didn't give titles in the first.
Yes, they did. They did to
and then
some
they
people.
rescinded them later on.
And did you ever hear of someone named Richard Nichols who was on a ship in the harbor and kind of threatened the Dutch so that they would give up? He was one of their agents, and he was selling land and making deals, and they were in England selling the same land and making deals. It wasn't handled very well.
In 1668, New Barbados before it was called New Barbados, it was purchased in 1668 by several landowners from the Caribbean. Berry, not Scarlet, Sanford, Kingsland. These are all names that we see all over the Meadowlands and the towns surrounding the Meadowlands like Rutherford and Lyndhurst. And people say that they're founding fathers. They are considered the founding fathers of these towns. And they were all from the Caribbean. They were all plantation owners and involved in slave trade. And people also don't really realize that they were related. A lot of them who were landowners in New Barbados were related through marriages, or they were just cousins. And what they did was, on their way to New Barbados to live, they picked up all of the slaves that they had titles to elsewhere so that they could get more land from the governors. You know, so they stopped in West Virginia, I mean in Virginia, they stopped in, you know, other places in the Caribbean. You know, picking up slaves, bringing them here, and then getting more land. So this, you can't really read it, but if you'd like to ever find out, this is a great document that we have. Any of you that are interested in the subject and who would like to develop this presentation that we're doing, please contact us. We have a lot of material that would be very difficult to go over in only, you know, this amount of time. But New Jersey, all of this is saying that in the beginnings, New Jersey is considered a slave state. That's the reputation it had in its beginning. I put this image in, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek because it's shows you the ideas of the English, the abolitionists thought, okay, you know, the Africans now are free, they can work and be happy. Well, but, you know, the Puritans settled in New Jersey and established the city of Newark in 1693, and it's very different than the Meadowlands in Bergen County that have a very, very bad, very violent, very rough slave trade, you know, sort of identity. Slaves were, you know, the population of slaves in Bergen County and in Hudson County was very great. Also in Perth Amboy. But somehow in Essex County it was a little different. There were slaves, but it, not as, the population was sort of lower, and Beverly found some great documents that show that in the 1850s. But there were free Africans, there were abolitionists, like the Howes, who were a mixed race family. There's some Cranes and the Davises. The Davises are like the founders of Bloomfield. The town was, Bloomfield was supposed to be called Davis, but Lord Bloomfield, General Bloomfield paid for all of the brownstone material for the church, so then they said, oh, we'll name it after, you know. But the Davis family actually owned the, well, no, it was the Crane family owned the monopoly of brownstone. And a lot of New York City brownstone buildings and Brooklyn buildings are, and Greenwood Cemetery are built of Belleville brownstone, that's what it's called. So that was basically the big material, that was one of the big monopolies that the Crane family had. So anyway, the whole point of this is to say that, you know, towards like the end of the 1600s, and the beginning of the 1700s, you already see manumission societies, and you know, we see preachers in churches giving sermons against slavery. We have a lot of that material. It's wonderful, but it would take a long time. If you're interested, let us know, and we'll point you in the right direction. This is something I've been working on for a few years now. In 1791, the Meadowlands are burned down, but they weren't meadows. They were 5,500 acres of forest. A lot of people don't know that. If you are on a train and you go through the Meadowlands during low tide, a lot of the water, you see these big fields of water and you see the blackened stumps. And the blackened stumps are, you know, a reminder of that fire of 1791. Local chronicle and newspapers say that the fire was started by sheriffs who set the fire on a windy day in Newark, and then in 4 days they were able to burn down the entire area. There were salt marshes, but it was mostly forest. And in my, when you study African American history, there's big voids. It's very difficult to piece together the real reality of our African American history. And why is that? Because there was a lot of abolitionist movement, but basically there was a lot of effort by the African American community. A lot of people say, oh, how wonderful the abolitionists and the church people, you know, they thought that slavery was bad, so they abolished it. In my opinion, it was a lot of work done by the black community to organize and to abolish slavery, like the Underground Railroad. Of course, you had white people that helped, but the big void that I'm finding in history about this fire, I mean, have any of you ever heard of this fact before?
No.
It's because it's a big void in history. And I'm beginning to come to the realization, when you want to find something out, and it's a fact and it's there right in front of your face, a lot of history that pertains to African American history is not recorded. Or it's rewritten, or, you know, we say whitewashed over. It's the truth. This is the Crane homestead in Montclair, and it's, if you go down Bloomfield Avenue and make a left on Valley Road, it's on the corner of Claremont Avenue and Valley Road. And it's one of the oldest houses in Montclair. It was, yeah. Now there's just a plaque on a rock. And this house and the Davis house in Bloomfield, which is thankfully preserved because it became the Bloomfield Steakhouse. But if you go there to have a hamburger or a steak, there's the menu that tells you about the tunnels. Now there was a tunnel, there still exists, according to them, the structure of the tunnels that goes from the Davis house in Bloomfield Center. It's sort of on Franklin Avenue, near to, let's say, the Parkway. So you could go from that house in Bloomfield, well, you could go from this house in Montclair all the way to Bloomfield underground. And later, we know that the Morris Canal was built, and that was a structure that fostered, the Underground Railroad, let's call it, the fleeing of slaves, like that. That was a structure that we know helped slaves to flee, because if you wanted to flee slavery, you would have to come to New Jersey from the west. You would cross the Delaware River. You come up from the south, cross the Delaware River, work your way through New Jersey in a series of safe houses, and then you get to our area here, which was considered more friendly, even though there were a lot of farms. Then Montclair, you'd enter through Crane's Gap, and from that little house, you saw before, the James Howe house, there's an underground tunnel, which we'll show you, that goes from that house all the way to the N Flag Factory. So you could get, you would, this is my opinion, analyzing the structure. You go there, you go underneath the toll of Bloomfield Avenue. Bloomfield Avenue was toll road. So you had like a major toll station at the beginning of Montclair, and then you'd go down Bloomfield Avenue. So there were militia groups like the Copperheads, and there were all these like terrible groups that were trying to prevent Africans from being free, and African Americans to work in factories, during. So you had these horrible militia groups like the Copperheads, whatever, very violent. So you had to hide. So you could go under Crane's Gap and surface on James Howe property, because the train tunnel was, that was where they were building the train tunnel on James Howe, an African American's property. And then you could go to the Crane house that was, a few hundred feet downhill, get in another tunnel and keep going, to leave. And where you wanted to go was New York City. So as long as you got to Jersey City, you could cross the river and get to New York, and there were all these regulations against slavery, slave trade, so you were basically on your way to freedom. But very interesting. Also the Belleville, I'm drawing a blank, the first The Reformed Church, yes, thank you.
Second River Church.
The Second River Church, yeah. It's said, I don't know because I don't find any research about it, but it could be a void in history. They say that there's a tunnel that goes under the Passaic River. We don't really know because we don't have any documents. It's just sort of something that's in the narrative. But just think, if you were a fleeing slave, once you got to the Meadowlands, you were really in trouble because you had, these, you even had pirates that were doing slave trade. They were stealing cargoes of slaves, and New Jersey was free. There were no arsenals, there were no real laws against slavery, so you had to cross this really terrible place of the Meadowlands, New Barbados, and all the landowners are defending themselves and their slave policies and things like that. So you had to cross that to get to freedom. So that was the worst stretch. So in the middle of the 19th century, in West Essex, we have two townships made out of a lot of villages. There's Caldwell Township, where you have the Caldwell Borough, Verona, Cedar Grove, North Caldwell, Westville, Franklin, Fairfield, Clinton. Then you had the Livingston Township. That was all part of this, really, at that time. Livingston, Centerville, South Caldwell, Roseland.
You need to know that Caldwell Township was established in 1798, and in 1813, Livingston broke away. So those two were separate then. And then this town and all the other ones, they started breaking apart in the 1890s. Verona and Cedar Grove were kind of a different story because they broke off as one piece and then they split. But in the early part of the 1800s, it was just two towns really, and after 1813.
Thank you. Perhaps we should present these together.
Okay. We tried to do a demographic profile of this area, given the information that we had from the census. For those of you that have done any family history, you know that the 1800, 1810, and 1820 censuses, the federal ones, are lost. New Jersey lost them. It's not the federal government's fault. So the first census that records New Jersey is 1830. 1830 and 1840 are what we call head of household census. So you'll have one person's name, and then there'll be those little grid that says how many people between what age ranges were living within that household. So the first one that had everybody's name was 1850. So we took some data and kind of pieced it together, looking at 1850 and 1860, and you can see, I don't know how the education one got ahead of us, but that's okay. In Caldwell Township in 1850, there were over 300 people that were enrolled in school. That means that the question on the census was, did you attend school in the last year? And so we know those are almost all children that are between the ages of 5 and 14. And Caldwell has a lot more than Livingston does then, because Caldwell covered a lot more area. There was also a question that said, over the age of 20 and unable to read and write. And you see there's a few in Livingston and many more in Caldwell. You can go ahead. These are the teachers that were here. And if you look at those last names, any of you that are history buffs will recognize these last names as founder families for New Jersey, and families that still live in this area. Once you do that part.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Then we had teachers here, and you can see there's a lot more teachers here than this is 1860, and they've just about doubled it, and they added a couple of music teachers, and they either lived with their family or they lived with their students' family. So we had a nucleus of education going on in here. Not one of these teachers was African American. I'm sure that's not a surprise. Go ahead. This was Livingston. It was really the same story. No African Americans among the teachers. Go ahead. And then there were the ministers, and this is the page where it gets very interesting. These were the ones that were in all of our towns, and some of these names would be familiar to you because the church congregation still remembers some of them. And I bet you none of you know about Reverend Peter W. Brewster, the first man on the list. I've never heard of the true Presbyterian Church, and I've been on the internet looking for some mention of it. But he's an African American, and he lived in Caldwell with his wife. Pages straight. He had a wife, Anne, and they had married about a year before the census was taken, about 1849, and they had a child, and her name, well, they didn't have a child. They had a child living with them, but she wasn't their child, and that was a common thing. She had a four-year-old living with them. And we've been trying to find out more about Reverend Brewster, and if you've ever heard of Donald Sinclair, who's a curator at Rutgers University Library, he wrote about an 18-page book attributed to a man named Jacob Rhodes called The Nation's Loss, a poem on the life and death of the Honorable Abraham Lincoln, published in Newark in 1866. Sinclair says that this poem was actually written by the Reverend Peter W. Brewster, and that it had been printed on a broadside that didn't mention anything about a publisher. So here we have this Caldwell minister, an African American, living with other African Americans, and of course he's honoring Abraham Lincoln, but apparently he didn't always use his own name. And anybody who ever hears of Peter Brewster, call me, because we're really trying to find out what happened to him. We don't find him in the 1860 census. He may have died, and he doesn't show up in 1840, but if he was living with somebody else, it wouldn't be in his name.
Also, the area was also beginning to become a place where you would come for the summer, and there were farms, but Caldwell has a rich history of, like as a resort. So maybe that was the beginning. Some people, you can't find them because they lived elsewhere.
Beverly?
Yes.
Wasn't there a time when the Presbyterian church here was a congregational church?
Mm-hmm.
The true Presbyterian that might have been some kind of countermeasure. I don't know whether the periods overlap somewhat.
It's possible, I don't know. The transfer to that was kind of an organizational thing rather than anything with their orthodoxy and their belief system. It was sort of like a management decision. Right. But you're absolutely right. The thing of it is that there were a lot of people who went. We had a lot of churches here. I mean, the Presbyterians, they get all the press because they had the best writer about their history. But a true Presbyterian church, who knows? They could have met in First Presbyterian, although Lockwood didn't pick it up. So it'll be interesting to find out. What I'm going to do is contact the Presbyterian archives, which are in Philadelphia, and see what they can tell us. So you're going to learn how we're doing this research, because this is really ongoing.
It's a lot. There's a lot that we're finding. It's amazing. It's going to be a long project.
Now these are kind of familiar names too. Some of these names lived into the 20th century, or the Hunter family, for example, which owned a part of the property that's now the Grover Cleveland Park. Stephen Personette, you've heard of that last name, as we cross that street every day. Lockwood was a very important, I think he was a mayor, but he was very wealthy and lived here in Caldwell. Elias French Maynard was very important. Orton is one of my favorites. Orton came here from Connecticut riding on a horse with all his possessions in his saddlebags. And he moved on he had a house built on Orton Road. He was a real physician. He was one of the founders of the Masonic Lodge here in Caldwell, and was a very active member of the community. So we have all of these people here, but none of them are black. Now, occupations in the Caldwells are really interesting. These ones that are listed as major, those are the numbers for the 1850 and 1860 periods, and this is going through the entire census for these towns, and you can see farmers is the big one. Although for a while, as I was transcribing it, I thought the shoemakers were going to win, but it was the farmers. I couldn't believe it. The tobacco related, that was from there's one company that accounted for almost all of that, and that's the tobacco factory that was started in 1806 and survived until the 1940s.
Excuse me.
Just a quick question.
Oh, sorry.
Do you know what a youth doctor is?
It's like an herbalist. There were several of them. Dr. Huh?
Homeopathic.
No, homeopathic has to do with the dosage size. Okay, it's a little bit different. Dr. Bone, Christopher Bone from Verona, had already passed away when this census was taken. Dr. Bone was a Hessian soldier during the Revolution who stayed, and he's the person who dammed the Peckham River to create the lake at Verona Park. And he was a kind of a doctor that dealt with herbs and things. These are the more minor, I'll move ahead to the next slide, is the more minor occupations.
Oh, can I just mention? One of the wealthiest chemicals merchant for medicine was Mr. Llewellyn Haskell from New York City. And his architect was Alexander Jackson Davis, a Davis from here. So Davis did a beautiful place for him in North Arlington, a castle that overlooked, the west and east. And unfortunately, his wife and children died of typhoid because their water tanks in the castle, the water came from the Passaic River, and that was already polluted from all of the, Industrial Revolution. So the root doctor, that's very interesting because he was like, I guess, a root merchant. And his company, after he founded Llewellyn Park, he founded the company called Merck. So he's basically who invented pharmaceuticals.
The other thing to remember is that servant domestic, it'd be easy to attribute those to African Americans. And there were a few who were servants, and that there were more who were laborers. That was a big one. But switch on to the next one. These are other miscellaneous occupations that were like one or two people. And there's quite a variety of things that you could do to earn a living in the Caldwells. And some of these were African Americans. One of them, I should go back to Peter. Reverend Brewster lived with another African American family. That was very common. It wasn't an African American thing. People would have more than one family in a house, or they would take in boarders. And they lived with someone whose first name is transcribed as P-A-R, as Parr Roberts, who was born in 1804, who lived with his wife Julia. And they had 3 children who were all born between 1843, 1847. He was a carter. That means he carted things. So some of them were coal carters, and they would drive coal around. But they had a wagon and then a horse, and they were for hire. And he also had another young man, African American, living with him, who was going to school, I believe. And he had a child with the same last name as the child who was living with the Brewster family, which is interesting. And they were all either African American, labeled as black or mulatto. But then he had a guy named Robert Ensign, who was from Ireland and was not black. And I guess he's the one who was going to school. So it just seemed kind of odd that they were just people who lived together for convenience, and you look in the next census and they're gone. And if you had looked probably a year later, they would be gone.
Beverly, what were the hucksters doing here?
Hucking. Okay, this is what I was just talking about with these families, so we can skip ahead. This is what the census form looks like in 1850, and it has the names on the left and then the age. So you have to figure out the year. That's why the year is usually written about, and then the sex, and then the color. So you see in the Roberts household, they have this one who's not black, who's not mulatto, and you notice that his wife is mulatto, but she's okay with her children being called black, I guess. I don't know. I thought that was really peculiar. And he was a carter. And then over on the right side, I'm sorry, those ditto marks have to do with where they were born. These guys were all born in New Jersey. We don't know where. And the center column says that they attended school within the last year. So the Irishman and the 2 older children attended school. So where were they attending school? They were going to whatever school existed in Caldwell. And this is what you have to do with African Americans in this area. Lockwood didn't cover them in his book. We had African Americans living all over the place here, and they were raising their families, and they were doing jobs and sending their kids to school. But to try and pull them out and find out who they were and what their lives were like, that's what takes us a lot of the time.
And also, what's important is the year, because this is very early. When you consider New Jersey a state that's has a heavily sort of identified with slavery, it's rather interesting to note that in Caldwell there were free African Americans who had businesses and houses and were going to school.
Now the column on the right that has two little things that says that over the age of 20 and not able to read or write. And it's not surprising that the woman would be listed that way. And Charles Blanchard, the other free African American who was living with them, he could have been a relative or not. It's hard to say, but that was how he described himself. Or whoever answered the census taker is how it was described. And the Brewster family, so we can skip on by that. This is the census for the Brewster family, and I put the ones after them. They're a split. The family that they were living with were on the other page, but they also were living next to the Corby family. The Corby family is a very well-known large family in Caldwell, and they were in a different lot. They were next door neighbors. Who knows how much space that they had. And they really kind of looked the same. Brewster and his wife got married within the year, so they were newlyweds, and they were taking care of Mary Blanchard, who was with, I think, the guy on the other page. And the wife is down there as illiterate, which is not surprising at all. Now you get to talk about Nathaniel.
This is Beverly usually covers all of the documents of Caldwell and Newark and the really old documents, whereas my expertise is more about Montclair and the Crane family in Montclair. But this is pertinent to our discussion of Caldwell and emancipation, because now I'll tell you the story that Major Nathaniel Crane, who died in 1833. Wrote his last will and testament in 1831, and he names James Howe of that little house that we call the Freed Slave House in Montclair. He names James Howe as a former slave that he manumitted, and he bequeaths him land and money in his will, and money to go into business and to share with his own family. And there's a clause in the will that says that all of his heirs. So, the Crane, Major Crane is protecting James Howe from eventual problems that he could have with this deed to the land. And he wills him his best part of his property in Montclair. It would now be the beginning of Upper Mountain Avenue at Claremont, about 10 acres, going down Upper Mountain Avenue. And that's where the train tunnel entrance is that I was talking about before. So he in the will, there's 10 acres of his best land in Montclair. There's, what was it, $400? Yeah, we're going to come. Yeah, but it was a lot of money. We're going to see that on the next slide. That's a lot of money. That's as much as Major Crane is leaving to his family members. And then he leaves him land in Caldwell, a mill, and then a toll bridge and land in the Meadowlands. So that, we were looking at the Meadowlands before with this sort of what I feel was possibly a revolt when they burned everything down. So that had to do with, abolition. Yes?
When you mention places like where there was a tobacco family, a tobacco factory, or a schoolhouse in Caldwell, or something up here, can you kind of tell us where it is?
You're absolutely right, and if
Yeah,
you do that
okay.
again, raise your hand again and remind me. The tobacco factory was about where 7-Eleven is.
On Bloomfield Avenue.
Okay, now you need to remember
Are
that
there any vestiges of these
Only the pictures.
There's a
Only
big
the
tree.
pictures, there's really
No,
nothing.
the tree had nothing to do. The tobacco factory actually originally was in 1806 on Fairfield Road. And during the Civil War, they moved it, or they tore that one down and built another one where the 7-Eleven is now. It was a really huge, it was a 4-story building, it was huge. And wasn't really the subject of this, but that's okay, we don't mind talking about it. And Lane Avenue was named for Isaac Lane of Lane and Lockwood Tobacco. But Lane and Lockwood were only 2 of the many, many partners that it had over the years. One of the earliest partners was named Campbell, of the Campbell family that lived in Caldwell, next to where the PNC Bank was before they closed it. So they're all very local things.
I was just requesting, if you're gonna mention a place, if you can just tell us if there's any vestiges left, where they would be
Right,
located.
it's
That's
important.
all.
You're absolutely
Yeah,
right.
thank you.
That's all.
Thank you.
Because I'd be curious to drive by if there were.
Well, you should be aware that there's the 5th grade gifted and talented classes in Caldwell are working on podcasts for self-guided tours of historic sites on Bloomfield Avenue. You'll be hearing more about that. Another resource, if you want to go and see the historic stuff in Caldwell, stop by the birthplace. Make sure you go on Wednesday through Sunday. Talk to Sharon Farrell, who's the caretaker there. She has been working on local history, tourism, heritage tourism for years, and she can probably give you a lot of information about places to go. Absolutely, yes, yes, all around here, and in Connecticut.
Off Runnymede Road,
We're gonna have to do a program
Yeah,
about the
we'll do a
tobacco
program.
factory.
You do one on the tobacco factories, wasn't there, what was Crane's Mill? Was that
Crane's Mill was a sawmill.
Sawmill.
It was originally a sawmill, and then later they added more equipment, and they added grist milling. But it wasn't the first grist mill. The first grist mill was the Harrison Mill, and that was also in West
Guys,
Caldwell.
can you do a presentation on all of those?
Yeah. The brook that runs down through Grover Cleveland Park was the site of several mills and a windmill, and Thomas Edison's grandfather, named Edison, owned a mill. I think it was behind the Presbyterian Church. We have so much history here in Caldwell. If you have any questions, please, I would invite you to contact the library. Contact us through the library. We're working all the time. Basically, we're the Historic Preservation Commission. We're always working on research. And so any questions you have, we're very welcomed.
And just so you know, the chairman of that committee is sitting right in the front row, Mr. Kaplan, and it's a good group.
Somebody contacted us because they wanted to know why their house was so unusual, and we went to have a visit, and we're discovering that it was an agricultural annex to a larger property where there's like this villa, and then there's this agricultural annex, and it looks exactly like an Italian winery. And I've lived in Italy most of my adult life, and I thought, this looks just like a winery that you would find in Tuscany or something like that. And basically, the owner of the house was Mr. Bastianelli, who was a very wealthy New York City merchant who was born in Italy in 1815, and he moved to Caldwell, and that was the last presentation, but we're still working on that. So there's so much to discover, and with your questions, we discover amazing things. So, please reach out to us. This is a map that, all right, Alexander Jackson Davis was an architect. He was from the Davis family. They were big abolitionists. He's also the architect that designed the New York Stock Exchange, and he designed a whole side of Washington Square Park in New York City. He designed the Lyndhurst Mansion in Tarrytown, New York, on the Hudson River. He was an architect. His grandmother was a crane. So his grandfather was Deacon Davis of the Bloomfield Church. His wealthy client, Mr. Haskell, who was sort of suffering having lost his children and his wife because of the cholera and typhoid, decided to purchase land here. His architect, Davis, said, come to West Bloomfield. It's a land of, a healthy land with wonderful water and mountain air. He's talking about Montclair, this whole area. So Mr. Haskell came here. He had a lot of money. and he bought land and developed Llewellyn Park. That's in West Orange. Llewellyn Park was almost twice the size, and the part that's no longer Llewellyn Park extends to Llewellyn Road in Montclair. But he also paid for the drafting of all of these maps. So that was Llewellyn Haskell. In 1856, this is the first map that we have sort of Montclair. And here you see James Howe, so that's 1857. You have to realize that, that's very early, even though Mr. Howe owned this property in the 1830s, this was remarkable, because there's so many covenants.
Go ahead.
Okay, there's so many covenants that I think that, it wasn't until the Equal Rights Amendment, or not even until the 1960s, that an African American could really freely buy land wherever he wanted in New Jersey, because of covenants. There were a lot of hidden laws.
And in deference to those of you who want to know about things that remain, Nathaniel Crane owned a house that was in a little town known as West Caldwell. So when you go to the library in West Caldwell, you look to your right across the street. It's kind of a black-colored. I've got a picture of it where it looks more dark blue, but that was the Nathaniel Crane house in West Caldwell, and it's the same family.
It's next to the police station.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Across from the library.
We'll try and point these things out.
Yeah. So I hope that you're getting your coordinates with the Cranes and Caldwell. It's a very rich history. So you have James Howe, Jason Crane. This is where the Crane homestead is, the one that is torn down and became just a boulder with a plaque. And Old Road is Claremont Avenue. That configuration up there is the intersection of Bloomfield Avenue, Claremont Avenue, and Pompton Avenue. And that's where the toll was. And when we saw the occupations, it said toll collector. It's because Bloomfield Avenue was a toll road. It was built by Israel Crane in like 1801, basically for agricultural transport. So that's why it was a toll road. And Turnpike, see, that's Bloomfield Avenue. So that's to give you an idea. And also, I like to point out that an adjacent property to the Crane property at that time was Lucy Stone's property. No, not at this, a little later, was Lucy Stone's property. And she is considered the founder of the American suffragette movement. And a typical sort of collaborator and friend of hers, and possibly a visitor all the time, was Julia Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And that's an underlying manumission, sort of anti-slavery, leading up to the Civil War. That's sort of like the real sort of significance of the Battle Hymn of the Republic is believed to be abolition. This is the will of Nathaniel Crane he wrote it in 1831, and he died in 1833. But this is the language that pertains to...
Oh, I was wrong, it's $300.
Oh, what is it? He let 10 acres on Upper Mountain Avenue isn't really that bad in terms of the value. But here we transcribed it, and it shows 10 acres in Montclair. Oh, 6 acres. Yeah, so that's pretty good. And $400. And all of he didn't have children. General Crane didn't have children, so he left a lot of properties to his nieces and nephews here in Caldwell. The Goulds, there's other names that don't really come to mind right now, but the Cranes that are here in West Caldwell, that was probably part of the thing, the will as well. These are documents from 1840 and 1850, census documents that show James Howe as being black, a laborer, and blind. And then you have his wife Susan, He's 64, she's 63, she's black, born in New Jersey. Oh, she's marked as illiterate. He's, yeah. So, and these are all the neighbors, and then you see the same as well up here, and that's remarkable in New Jersey to see these kinds of deeds.
One of the things we were trying to do was figure out about the descendants of James Howe. And we looked at the 1840 census, and we looked at who was living, well, not who, but how many people, what sexes and what ages were living with him. And we figured out that it was a woman, a girl child, and a boy child. That's what we figured out at certain ages. So then when we looked 10 years later at the 1850 census, we found James and that his wife was Susan. But next door was somebody named Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver's birth date was within the range that fits the 1840 census. And then when we looked at other things in the Oliver family, we think that Mary Oliver was really Mary Howe and had been married. This is part of being a detective thing with some of these documents. We also think we have found the son.
Right, now we'll go over that. This is an amazing breakthrough because when I lived in Montclair, we were trying to figure this out, and I've been working on this for years, and finally we were beginning to find documents. This is the 1830 census, that of Caldwell.
This is the sample one. All these little hash marks over here are indicating that which category they fit into, and you practically need a ruler to be able to go through it. And the first, 6 columns are for white males, the next group are for white females. So then turn the thing over, turn that to the next one. This is the rest of that page. This looks like it has the same number of marks because it does. You're looking at them back through the paper. So you have to ignore all the ones that go left to right, top to bottom, and look at the ones that go left to right, bottom to top, like that. And those are these columns are the slaves. So there's a fair amount of slaves in Caldwell. We've been looking at free blacks, but we're also looking at slaves in Caldwell.
However, the number is relatively low. I think it's characteristically low for New Jersey. I believe there's, did we make a count of about 6 or 10?
Yeah.
In the whole Caldwell area. So, and it was all farms, so that's quite low in my opinion. This is another document of Caldwell.
And this has totals of white and freed colored people. And again, the colors are, that's these columns over here. And there's a fair amount of them. The column totals are 1, 10, and then 2 single. So there's 13, 16, 19 in Caldwell in 1850. I'm sorry, 1840.
And here you have basically the same information you see. I'm reading William Gould.
Those are the veterans.
Right. And
You know who William Gould was? This is when you can go see his grave. He was buried in the old burying ground. William Gould was a very important person in Caldwell. He was a private during the Revolution. His father was then a lieutenant in the Revolution. His brothers were in the Revolution, and one of them stayed home to take care of the farm. During the Whiskey Rebellion of 1797, I think, General Gould was Major Gould, and he went with Caldwell men and George Washington to put down the tax rebellion that was going on in Pennsylvania. And during the War of 1812, William Gould was a brevet general. We think that he organized a cavalry unit and bought a flag for that unit, which is housed in the Crane House in West Caldwell, that you can visit anytime. Just call us and make an appointment, and we'd be happy to show you the flag. But you can see his grave over in the old burying ground.
And I believe that didn't General Gould's backyard become Essex Fells?
Yes. His house is still there. Oh, and by the way, Henry Lane is from the Tobacco Company. So these are all local people. The Kent family, I can't even keep track of the Kents, there's so many.
When you say where, the Gould House is still there, where?
Okay, we're gonna.
No, we're getting there.
Oh.
If, across the street from the police station, so you're on the left side if you're facing south, and there's there's private tennis courts there.
Are you talking about Roseland
Yes,
Avenue?
I'm sorry.
It's on a corner, there's a road, Forest Road that goes up through Essex Fells, and across the street from this house is the fire department.
Okay.
But there's private tennis courts on the lot. I think it's number 252. I've been told that the people who own it aren't interested in local history, so we don't bother them.
Oh,
But
You
we
see a
would
trough,
love to
you
see it.
The drinking trough of the horse.
oh
You can see the drinking trough of a horse?
Yeah.
It's right on Roseland Avenue. You see a well, it's amazing.
Is it right near the police station?
Mhm.
It's
That
right
little
across the
compound?
street.
Yeah,
Across the street from the police station?
Yeah, it's that White House across the street from the
but
police
it's set
station.
way back from the road. You have to kind of slow down and look for it.
But you can't see that?
Mhm.
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay.
It has a gambrel roof, and it's articulated with like different volumes, and it's a white clapboard with a gambrel roof.
That's all, when I go home.
Right.
Well, it'll be dark, but yeah.
Okay, that's very.
This is is that, am I reading person?
Yeah. This is from the 1850 census. Slavery was still legal in New Jersey, and they put out a special schedule for slaves. So you see Schedule 2, slave inhabitants in the township of Caldwell in the county of Essex. There's one slave listed, and he is called the estate of Jonathan Beach. They know his no name, his age I think is on something else. Yeah, he's 72, but he's a male and he's black. And Stephen Personette, the doctor, he's the one who signed this schedule. We'll go to the one, we transcribed it so that you could actually read it. He was certified to be the only slave inhabitant in Caldwell in 1850.
Which is, it's very good compared to the rest of Bergen County and other places.
He wasn't owned by the doctor. The doctor he had a role in the census of certifying the census. He was owned by the estate of Jonathan, who was dead. And the Beach family lived in North Caldwell on Mountain Avenue. You know where the rocks are that you got to go through the cliffs
When you
up
go
there.
down.
Would he be buried here at all?
Probably.
In the in the old graveyard?
It could be in the old burying ground. The old burying ground was sort of closed off during the Civil War when they built Prospect Hill Cemetery. But if you had a family member there, then you could be buried there. I'd have to go and look it up. I'd probably have it somewhere.
I've seen some local names in Newark, in the cemetery that's on Route 21. I forget the name of the cemetery. So this is a diagram of James Howe, and I just wanted to read this. It's from the census of, I believe, 1850.
No, 40.
Oh, 40, I'm sorry. And James is married to Susan, and his record suggests that they had 2 children, a daughter and a son, born both between 1805 and 1815. Combining this data with, in the 1850 census, when Mary was 39, born in 1811, gives additional evidence that she is the daughter aged 24 to 35 in 1840, the daughter who then married Oliver. So James Howe had 2 children, a son and a daughter. The daughter married Oliver, and the Oliver family continued to live in the house until the 20th century. And they even sold the corner of their property, the corner of Upper Mountain and Claremont, to the Wiggins Welsh family of Welsh Farms, and they built that mansion with the round, do you know the mansion with the round portico on the side of it? It's on the corner of Upper Mountain and Claremont. And then right behind that is the little house called the Freed Slave House, or the James Howe House. And then where the Montclair Academy playing field is right behind that, the new playing field, all of my life when I went to Montclair Academy, every day I would see the opening of the tunnel. Because when they did the test bore for the train, they struck a vein of water and it made a whole new branch of Tony's Brook flow out. And it also created Frog Hollow, a neighborhood in Montclair that's a floodplain. And that's another African-American neighborhood that is documented back to the Revolutionary period, actually. Yeah, it's very interesting. This is the house. Are you familiar with this house?
Yes.
That's James Howe's house. Now, James Howe's history is, in Montclair, we know this house as the Freed Slave House. It's a very important landmark. And nobody really knows the story. It's not really talked about or known today where the Howe family is and whatever. I actually know descendants of the Howe family that talk about the black branch of their family. And I'm going to kind of go into that now. This is just a document showing the status as a landmark, as a historic research. We actually had this house landmarked, finally. It took a long time. They wanted to move it, actually, so that would have really, really hurt the significance, I believe. This very bad image is, what you see is actually Claremont Avenue, and that's the project for the underground train tunnel. That's not actually where it is. It's a little bit farther. You see that other line, that's Tony's Brook. They sort of moved it back towards the brook, and they hit a vein, as I said, and they made the brook turn into this big, waterway practically back then. The train tunnel was never completed because of the panic of 1878. They went bankrupt. And as I said, this test bore, supposedly, I've never been down there, a friend of mine has, who lived on the property of the Van Vleck property. There actually is a test bore, it's a tunnel, you can go, they say it's in very bad shape, it's caved in, you don't go, from there to the Annan Flag Factory today, but that's where it supposedly is traced. This is a house in Llewellyn Park. It's by Alexander Jackson Davis, the architect that I mentioned before, who brought Mr. Haskell and all of his money out here. This house is known in Llewellyn Park as the Underground Railroad House. And this year, I was part of this initiative. They had the tunnel, because everyone knows that this house had tunnels. If you go upstairs, now do you know Lyndhurst Mansion in Tarrytown? It sort of looks like it. It's the same architect. There's this big, long library on the second floor, just like in the Lyndhurst Mansion, and it has all of this boiserie woodwork that, some of them, if you punch them, they open. And the roof lines are very deceiving. I don't know if it was completely intentional by A.J. Davis, who was an abolitionist, but you could hide like hundreds of people in this house. So this house is known to us, that know Llewellyn Park as as the Underground Railroad House. And we did open the tunnels with the rangers because, Llewellyn Park is a national parks site or something like that. And we opened the tunnels, and yes, there are tunnels, and they're now closed up again to preserve them for further research. So on the other side of this house, there's a huge round window, bigger than this table, with a pentagram. And it was said, or I believe that, if you illuminated that room at night, even if it was just gas or candles, you could see it for miles, really. So it was like a beacon. It was like, Llewellyn Park was an abolitionist community. It was founded by Swedenborgists because Mr. Haskell and Davis, they were all of this religious sect called Swedenborg. And the Swedenborgists believed that art and nature were divine. And Calvert Vaux, who designed the roads in Llewellyn Park and also the roads in Central Park, New York, used the natural configuration of the land because they thought that, nature, all that is nature is divine in art. So this is a remarkable house, and I wanted to show it to you as sort of you know, this is what a safe house, this is a very ornamental, like a temple of all monuments to safe houses, because it was in a hidden community of abolitionists. But this picture is William Reed Howe. His father is Henry Howe, and I'm sorry, I have to correct that. William Howe, the son of Henry Howe, is a founding board member of Llewellyn Park, and he's also an attorney. And it's interesting that he and his father are very involved with train engineering, and he actually did the project for the train line within the Chicago World's Fair. So, you know, don't forget, at the Howe property back in Montclair, about a mile away, there's this train tunnel being dug that is possibly also a way of people getting into Montclair from underground and under Bloomfield Avenue and the Turnpike. This gentleman, who is a trustee of Llewellyn Park, is also a farm. They say he's a real estate developer of farms with the Crane family. And they both, the Crane family, and there is a Howe who is an immigrant, a Scottish immigrant named James Howe, like the freed slave in Montclair, who settled in Connecticut with the Cranes and Robert Treat. And, you know, we know that Robert Treat and the Cranes and these Puritans came to Newark in the 1600s, so it's quite fascinating. So what we're doing is, you know, James Howe, what happened to his family? Well, we're finding he had a son and a daughter. The daughter stayed there on the property with the Olivers. But then the son, who is the son? So we're finding the name Henry Howe, who was born black, and he lives with the Dormists, who are the Cranes, you know, they're cousins, and it's fascinating. That's what we're working on now, and this is what the documents that we're finding, is that, and we know that his father, William Howe's father, was Henry Howe, that we know, and in my opinion, if you look at this engraving, I believe, in my opinion, that this man is of mixed race. There's other people that agree with me. But now we're finding the documents that prove that. Here you have, this is Eagle Rock Avenue. This is Llewellyn Park. We're looking at West Orange, near the Edison factories would be here. Bloomfield is Bloomfield Way in Llewellyn Park. Do you know Llewellyn Park? It's the world's first gated community. And this is Valley Road going to Montclair. But if you see this, you see the Eastview Garden and Poultry Farm, Henry B. Howe. That was the father of the gentleman on the other side that we're connecting to be the son, possibly, of James Howe, the freed slave. Because in documents it says that he's black. And he's actually living with, you know, Crane relatives, the Dormis family.
The interesting thing about the Doremus family is not so much their connection to the Cranes, in my opinion. It's that, you know, there are two books called Reminiscences of Montclair. One of them is by Watkins and the other is by a Doremus. Well, what's really interesting is that Watkins was Samuel Watkins, who was a dentist in Montclair, who moved his home to North Caldwell and his part of his dental practice to Caldwell. He went around with like 3 different initials in front of his name, but the first one was Samuel. Well, it turns out he married into the Doremus family, and one of the Doremuses, a son named Owen, he had a house, and he ran a stage that went from Orange to Newark. And one of the people who lived in his house was Henry Howe. So when you think about the Doremus family, Peter Doremus wrote the other book, Reminiscences of Montclair. Both of these books mention James Howe, the Howe family. And so there's a connection between the Doremuses and the Watkins and the book and the Howes that we're teasing out. Because I kept wondering, well, how did somebody know the story of James Howe Why would Doremus have put it in his book, and why is it in the History of Montclair book? But everybody goes to the Reminiscences books, both of those, and uses them for their history. But it turns out that they were all interconnected through marriage or just through affiliation.
The other slide just had this piece of land that belonged to Howe, and that intersects with Valley Road in Montclair, and today it's called Howe Street. And nobody really understood why. You know, that sort of got lost in local narrative. And but I do know a family from Llewellyn Park who then moved to New York City, and they live on Park Avenue. And they often talk about the black branch of their family. And so this is all the work of documenting African American history. It's very complex, there's a lot of voids, and you have to be very patient. This is amazing. This is a narrative of a former slave named Uncle Anthony Thompson. Yeah, this would be a 4-day presentation on its own, so if anyone's interested, we'll be more than happy to talk to you about it. I just wanted to put this in. I think that we're sort of running late, so I want to wrap up as quickly as possible. We have this timeline that's by Cheryl Jennifer LaRoche, and she's doing an excellent investigation on abolitionist activity and emancipation. Her feelings are, I believe, it's more something from the black community than it was from the white abolitionist community. All of the work of emancipation and freedom was a lot of hard work done by black people, by the black community. So it's coming to light more today that, you know, there were abolitionists, there were people, you know, ministers, a lot of people that were against slavery, but it was also a lot of work by the African American community. So this is a timeline, and what's remarkable about it is that it took 430 years from the first slaves that arrived in Paul's Hook in Jersey City to the time of emancipation in New Jersey. That's 425 years. This is a very beautiful photograph of an Essex County African American family in front of their house. I believe it's from about 1890. This is our Zenith Crane house from 1853 near to Crane's Mill. We invite you all to come and have a visit. It's beautiful. Is there something that we would like to say about that? Oh, this is a desk that...
This Crane family in West Caldwell owned slaves. And one of the slaves was a skilled carpenter, and they had him build a desk for their son. This is with the desk shown open. Now the house burned down in 1848, so how could a desk have survived? Well, in those days, you took the desk to the school. So the desk was built, and they took it to the school. It was an academy, but these academies were like one room with a minister or somebody and 1 or 2 students. And the purpose was to prepare the student to go in, a lot of times to go into Princeton as a sophomore. That was the route that they usually took, because they didn't really have high schools that much, and they called them academies. So this desk must have been at the academy in Caldwell when the house burned down, which is why we have a desk made by a slave in the 1740s. That it's in the front hall of the Crane House. You can see it if you come and visit. We did find evidence of that the Cranes had slaves. It shows up in the census. We don't have names, but we're still researching. And just to underscore something that Frank said, it's really the responsibility of all of us to know our history, to do research on our history, to remember our history. We don't all have to do the same things or travel the same paths. But it's really clear that the history of African Americans in ordinary communities like Caldwell and in Essex County has really been neglected. And that's one reason that the Historical Society of West Caldwell decided to get involved with the New Jersey chapter of the African American History and Genealogical Society, which is a national group. Because we don't know enough about our history of African Americans in Caldwell, but we're trying to learn. And we invite those of you who have even a question can be informative. But we're so glad that you were interested enough to come tonight.
And I'd like to thank the library for offering us the opportunity to present the material, and to the Markmans for graciously recording this. It will be available on YouTube. And if you please have any questions, you can contact us through the library. We're delighted to do whatever we can to answer your questions. Thank you.
Do you have any questions now?
Well, I saw three names I recognized from specifically Baldwin's, Condits. I didn't see which Condit that was.
We
But
must help.
Steve-
There's so many cranes and convents.
And Llewellyn.
Yeah.
They're all,
Well, if you,
very.
the direction happened that they would come in, from the Atlantic, and they would go through Paulus Hook, and they went into Newark, and then they kept going west. The thing to remember is that the Dutch came in before the English, so some of the Dutch got there first. If you imagine a line between Belleville, Montclair, Caldwell, and all the way out to the Passaic River, along that line you find lots of people living that were intermarried Dutch and English. North of that line, it's Dutch, and that's why Upper Montclair is the Van Giesen family. The Van Giesen purchase was up there. And down here, you see a lot more of the English names. By the time they get out to Morris County, there's a lot of intermarriage, and so you see all these weird versions of names that have been turned into Dutch or turned into English, depending on whichever way they were marrying.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to pass this to Claudine, but also I'd like to mention, because it's Black History Month, that my house in Essex Fells is designed by Edward Bowser Jr., who is considered one of the first architects to African American architects to design houses in the state of New Jersey, and he was not allowed to. They sort of kept failing him in the exam. There were no black architects at that time in the 40s, but he really didn't mind that because he went off to work for Le Corbusier in Paris for about 8 years. So he came back and did a few houses in New Jersey, and then went to live with Africa and his wife and founded a design institute, and that's where he passed away. So anyway, thank you very much.